A colleague on many important studies for the National Cancer Institute. I just got a publication from him through LinkedIn or one of those things. The scientific one, and Steve is a co-author on a report, the long-term trends in dental X-rays dosed to the thyroid gland. So they looked at the transition there's been in equipment, and they're doing, and National Cancer Institute is funded and does a lot of science work. And I think Steve Simon simply took it upon himself to finish this off without a specific funding level authorization. Or, you get any project, you're like me, you want to know three things: good, fast, and cheap. And you can choose any two of those that you want. You can make it good and fast, it's going to cost a lot of money. You can make it fast and cheap, it ain't going to be good. Or you can make it whatever the third combination is. I don't think Steve ever had that defined for him. When was his job supposed to be completed by? How much funding was he supposed to take to do it? And I think that's part of the reason it's taken him 15 years. And to his credit, he's finally coming out with a report in the spring. I'm very eager to see it. And I'm very eager to see. I've provided him comments much along these lines as a colleague, telling him, you need to look at the cisterns, you need to look at this. And I need to look at lens of the eye and skin exposures. I provided calculations for him at the time. And so I do hope that he factors those in and comes up with a comprehensive study. But we'll have to, I don't know what's in it. We'll have to see what comes out in the spring. Go ahead.
Hi. I might have missed this, but I was wondering, when you're calculating dose rate, the different figures that you use, do you have different numbers for humans based on age? So like dose rate to children, babies, pregnant women for their unborn child, or is it a standard coefficient that's used for all humans?
Right. In the 60s, we had a couple. It was one. We had a at Oak Ridge, Isabel Tipton. She collected tissue samples from autopsies from around the world and analyzed the chemical composition of all the tissues. And they published a book called Reference Man, and that gave if you have a thymus gland, what's in a thymus gland? What elements? What's the typical weights and masses of thymus? I don't even know where the thymus is actually. But I hate biology. But if you look at it, it was a monumental work that defined what a human body consisted of. And after that, they hyperfine split it. My thesis was building a representative person of cylinders to do neutron calculations and measurements on. So they've become far more sophisticated today with these MRIs and other imaging technologies. They now have far more sophisticated anthropomorphic phantoms. And in the Japanese survivor data, they do have a series of families. I think they're hermaphrodites. They have both female and male parts because it's quicker to do the calculation that way. Although I may stand, that may have changed recently. We may have separated it out just because of slight difference. There ain't that much difference when you come out of the shower, let's put it that way. But I believe that they do have fully anthropomorphic phantoms today to calculate the dose. It depends on the situation. In many situations, like a regulation, like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission wants to have a regulation, power plants can't release more than this amount of radioactive materials, right? It's a very small number from a power plant today. When they passed the rules, the anti-nuclears said, well, it's too high, and then the nuclear power plants said, well, we're way below it, and then the NRC said, well, if you're way below it, why do we put the limits there? They've slowly jacked the limits down so low that very little is released. In those situations where it's a regulation, there's standardized calculations that don't factor in 5-year-olds, but many of the meetings I go to, I usually skip out of those sessions. They go into grindy, very detailed models. There are models that are used, and on the other hand, they're very other purposes or for technical analyses. In large-scale projects, if you're like the Utah downwinders, nobody's gone in and weighed each one of them. And this one's a male. He's 5'10", weighs 187 pounds. He's got longer arms like I do, or shorter. You know, they don't go into that detail. In fact, they don't even bother to go to that detail. They use a standardized thing and say, wow, this is bad. And then Congress says, this is how much we can afford. We'll cover these counties. That's how it works. On the other hand, when you go in for radiation therapy, they today use MRI and other imaging technologies to get detailed internal images. They'll align, if it's a single solid tumor, they'll carefully align it in the center of rotation of these big machines so that they can spread the radiation out on all your healthy tissue and really hammer the tumor if it's a solid tumor. Medical physics had remarkable strides with anthropomorphic phantoms, including individualized phantoms for radiation therapy.
Joe, thanks for coming to New Mexico, and thanks for your talk. It's good to see you. But my question is, in regard to, I don't think these are working, in regard to epigenetics. So it's something that we've been talking a lot about over the years here in New Mexico, because we see with families who are near Trinity, right, we see a lot of instances of second, third, fourth generation cancers, RICA-covered cancers, and other illnesses.
Let me talk about that, and it ain't a short and easy answer, but I think to give you enough background information to help you understand the issue. During the 40s, 50s, even up to about 1959, people who worked in my field, radiation protection or in the medical arts, really believed the genetic effects dominated the effects of radiation. We really believed it. And part of it is, I have to go into biology, and I hate biology. Cells can either divide in two ways. They can divide with mitosis, where a cell actually, like your skin cell, will separate, form a new skin cell, and propagate skin cells. Or meiosis, where the female and male partners each contribute half a chromosome and they come together, right? And so, because of extensive experiments on Drosophila melanogaster, if Mueller's still here, because of all these experiments on plants, if you wanted to do a radiation study in the 30s and 40s, by golly, it was easy to take Frobisher lousewort plants and stick them under an X-ray machine and see if the pestils turn blue or pink or something. You know, it's very easy to do. And the effects with mitosis, if you break a chromosome or change it, that effect is then propagated through successive generations. So you could produce amazing effects. Meiosis, mammal propagation, is a very different process. And oftentimes, you don't form a viable fertilized egg if the two chromosomes can't match up. So if there's enough damage, you tend to clean out a lot of genetic damage in each generation. So by 1959, we had changed our viewpoint because we had the Japanese data coming in like gangbusters and realized leukemia is very important and cancer formation in the Japanese is very important. And that began to realize, and we changed our emphasis to be cancer. It doesn't mean genetics went away, it's just on a scale, we thought genetics was very important, cancer was important but not too bad. And by 59 it swung the other way. Whoa, cancer in the Japanese is very important, genetics isn't that important. Now the funniest thing happened, we had the Human Genome Project, which built magnificent machines. You can take a swab of your mouth and send it in to Ancestry.com and they tell you where you're born. The Japanese researchers in that Radiation Effects Research Foundation have started asking the question, are there genetic effects being propagated in the Japanese survivors? And that would be a really important thing. And because of this wonderful machinery for synthesize or for stripping off the chromosomes, individual genes and assembling them, you're now able to test that with unbelievable sensitivity. And the fellow who's doing the work, I forget his name, he's a Japanese doctor, And he was reluctant to join because everyone thought that's an American operation, but he slowly was lured in and is one of their researchers now in this very field, genetic effects of radiation. And he said, you know, when I started out, I thought it was like you got a clean piece of sheetrock and you got a shotgun. And the clean piece of sheetrock is your chromosomes, and the shotgun is the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Boom, shoot the shotgun, and all those little pellets fall out, form all those little holes. I had a figure, it sort of looks like this one. And he said, this ought to be really simple. I'll just crank up this genetic machinery, we'll put the survivors, there's still quite a number of survivors through, we'll look at progeny, we will just be able to spot it right away. And he realized quickly, we all accumulate genetic damages. Watson and Crick discovered the chromosome, defined the geometry for the chromosome, they won the Nobel Prize for it. Watson had his own chromosomes analyzed, and they found he had 50 defects or something, 50, I forget what the 50 were, but there were 50 damages. So the Japanese doctor said, he now begins to realize what you have in the human chromosome, in the human population, our chromosomes at age, when we're older, already look like this. And now, shoot it with a shotgun blast, you got a bunch of extra holes. And he says, my job is a lot more complicated because I've got to separate out. It isn't a clean slate where you could just look at, this is what the bomb caused, because there wasn't anything before it, boom, the bomb happened, boom, we now see it with this wonderful new cell machinery or chromosome machinery. But he's now saying, wow, this is a really complicated problem. So the genetic effects and epigenetic effects that you mentioned haven't gone away. They became far less important than cancer to radiation protection professionals in about 1959, when advisory bodies started saying, whoa, Japanese data has indicated we really got to look, we've got to control the amount of radiation a radiation worker gets to limit their risk of cancer. And the genetic effects, because of this process, the meiosis, naively perhaps, they assume that you get a lot of clean out in each generation because we're all getting background radiation continuously from rocks and the radioactivity in soil and from cosmic radiation coming from the sky. We're getting more and more radiation progressively from the more advanced forms of medicine, although they improve the technologies each year, but we're doing more and more diagnostic procedures. So we're getting, the human genome pool is getting a lot of insults. And separating those out, they're trying to do it now in Japan, but they haven't. I know I haven't given you the, I don't know if I've answered your question.
I didn't actually ask my question, but it's okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Okay, other people have questions. Ask your question.
Well, afterwards, come up if you want. I'm on East Coast time still, so this is only whatever, something o'clock for me. Go ahead.
For the instant of Barbara Kent, what was the timeline between the initial Trinity testing to Barbara?
I'm not hearing him at all.
In Barbara Kent's case, what was the timeline between Trinity's testing to Barbara actually having contact with the follicles that were probably...
The water in the cisterns, when did that occur?
They said in the case of Barbara Kent,
Yeah.
what was the time frame between the actual test and when she was exposed?
Only a couple of hours. You know, she was exposed during the short duration, shortly after the bomb. The beta radiation in the fallout was very high, and that's what gave her the couple hundred rads to the follicle, to the hair follicles.
The interesting thing about Barbara Kent, and we know her well because she's an advocate with us in our fight for compensation, is that she's had multiple cancers herself, and she's had multiple miscarriages. She has 3 daughters. They've all had cancer. Her mother and brother, who were in Rio Doso that day as well, both developed brain tumors. So that's not a normal history. And I don't know, Dr. Shonka, I've never told you this story, but we do have a gentleman alive today in Tularosa that drove across the highway there from Socorro. It's from San Antonio to Carrizozo, and it was a dirt road back then. And he's in his 90s now. And when he got to Tularosa, he did have burns all over his body that blistered. And he encountered a convoy of soldiers that told him, roll up your windows, don't stop, get out of here as fast as you can. There's poison in the air. And I always tell him, Daryl, you're alive today to tell this story, because if I told it, nobody would believe me. And yeah, and he was treated in El Paso. I have a number of questions for you, but the one I really want to ask, I'm going to be in a car with you for a lot over the next few days. The one I really want to ask, how was it that the information on the infant mortality was not made available to you all when you worked on the La Hadra study? I find that to be not just remarkable, but unacceptable, honestly.
I agree. I was shocked when I saw the Alvarez paper, because if we had seen anything like that, we would have pulled it. There's there's a dozen or more scientists who worked on the project. I can't speak for the others, but I think any of them, if they had seen infant mortality in the wake of Trinity, that would be a huge thing. It would have been a lot of fun to, as a scientist, to discover it. We did not. Now, Los Alamos went through a lot of issues that were used or caused us to have to suspend the project. That's why it took 10 years instead of 3. And in one case, they became concerned when we began looking through files that dealt with the legal department. And the legal department had concerns. Was there information in there that would be called privileged and confidential for an attorney? If you're an attorney and you're working on a case and you ask someone to write a memo to explain something to you, that's a privileged communication that should not be discovered. They don't want discovered. And that's the way U.S. law works, is my understanding. And the law department, the legal office at LANL, expressed grave concerns about our project. So negotiated between DOE, LANL, and CDC was an agreement that we would look at the titles of their files to see what we wanted to look at, and they would decide what in there we'd be allowed to look at. So it was compared to other collections of documents, it was very constrained. We were very limited. And so before that happened, there was a famous case in Oklahoma, the Karen Silkwood case. And she worked at a plutonium factory. Her apartment was grossly contaminated, and she was later killed in died in an auto accident. But she was gravely concerned about her exposure to plutonium. And so the company, Kerr-McGee, paid, and DOE agreed, paid for her to come to Los Alamos to be counted in their sophisticated whole body counter and to be counseled by the LANL scientists who dealt with plutonium on a more routine basis. So I came across that box, and there's a lot of, I don't want to talk out of school, it was a lot of fun because it was such a prominent case to read about it. But as you read about it, it had nothing to do with releases from Los Alamos. It was just a citizen who was exposed to plutonium elsewhere came for measurement and advice to LANL. But it was fascinating reading. So if you had a file in the legal department, and this box would have been, and it said Karen Silkwood case, I probably would say, well, I'd like to look at it, but I don't need to look at it. But in many other cases, files might have been written with vague titles, which would be difficult to decide. So we had to rapidly go through a list of titles and define the cases that we really thought we needed to look at. And that process apparently failed. Is the best. There may be other materials, but I really suspect that there were files in the legal department that contained these letters dealing with infant mortality from, and I don't know how they work, the work, I gotta say, it was a lot of fun. It was a real privilege to be involved with La Hadra. I came across one, Teller is a famous nuclear scientist. His Dr. He's very famous. He's German and was very, very smart. And so I was coming through what essentially was a desk dump in a box. It had all kinds of different records. And I came across these handwritten sheets by Teller. In 1942, he was writing to the then head of what was called the Uranium Project in the government before the Manhattan Project, saying, well, the results from Chicago where they had built a reactor, the first reactor, were very promising and we need to proceed with development of the nuclear weapon. That was his letter. He was writing it on a train in California. He rewrote the letter in longhand and pencil 7 times, changing his English because he was so insecure as a native German that he was correctly writing the statement in English. And so I went through it and I said, hell, this is fantastic. You know, it's such a privilege to read it, so fun to discover it. And I took it into Roger Mead, who was at the time the archivist for Lionel. I said, Roger, I don't know what to do. I'm going through this box. It looks like somebody dumped out their desk, but they had this letter from Teller. Roger was so excited beyond words to discover original material by Teller. So you came across things in very strange circumstance. It's possible that the materials dealing with infant mortality are buried somewhere, but Lionel keeps records on everything. We develop procedures for how we're going to review material. In part, we wanted to make sure if we went through a box and said, this report here, we need to have copied, declassified, and provided to the project. Well, we wanted to make sure we got the whole report, that it wasn't extra, so we had a procedure file. We listed everything we went through. We said what documents we wanted, how many pages there would be, just so we'd have a record. Lionel kept all those records too. And if Lionel could show me that somebody, hopefully not me, one of the other guys, went through and totally missed that, I'll be very embarrassed. I'll be shocked. But I'll also say, wow, we missed it. The process failed. And that's such a phenomenal failure. I just would be aghast at it. But I believe the real answer is we were never provided access to that information because it's so striking. You'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind or something, some politically. So how could you possibly miss that type of information?
That whole process is an embarrassment.
So it seems that in their desire to prevent inadvertent release of privileged and confidential information, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what that might be. It seems that their attempt to control that, to completely eliminate it, perhaps had an unfortunate side effect that material that we really should have gained access to, we did not. So I'm curious to see. It'd be very interesting to see why that occurred. I wrote CDC after this spring when I saw the Alvarez thing, and that was in a lot less time than I've been talking about it here. I read the abstract for the Alvarez thing, and I said, holy cow, how did we miss that? I mean, that was my immediate and shocked reaction to it. And that very day, I wrote to CDC saying, this report, Alvarez's paper I was provided, is coming out, and this is what he reports, and it deals with Trinity, and it's material that I had not seen before, we didn't know about, and I was just real surprised at it. So I don't know what steps they're taking in regards to discovery. I don't know where it is. Yeah, go ahead.
How did you not know? Because you all knew where it was, when and where it was being created, and you all knew when and where it was being tested. So how could you not know that information?
You mean the information about infant mortality?
All of
I'll
that.
tell you. Well, we did not, as a project, we did not have a mission to go to the State of New Mexico Department of Vital Statistics, whatever it is called, gather all of the vital statistics on deaths, causes of deaths, births, live births, and all of the health statistics for the state of New Mexico and analyze all that data. If there was a huge effect, there might have been funded at later phases of the project, but our job was to go through the record centers, find any document that an expert would use to determine how much material or what type of material or what material got off site, and what quantities got off-site to allow a future stage of the project to determine if there was a deleterious effect or an impact from that release. We weren't charged with discovering new material. We're just charged with going through what Los Alamos had and making sure we got anything they had dealing with off-site releases and impacts from off-site releases. So I apologize that we didn't do it, but our mission was, and it was an arduous mission in the sense that it's very difficult to manage a project when it's turned off, turned on, turned off, turned on. You got employees, you're paying them salaries, you're paying them benefits. All of a sudden, okay, we can't do anything at Los Alamos. Where do we go? You know, how do I generate the revenue to pay their salaries? Because that, go ahead.
Joe, I just want to make sure or make clear that as I question you about this, I don't think that it was a misstep on the part of those of you who worked on La Hadra. In my mind, it's more likely that this was information that was suppressed by LANL. In my mind, it makes more sense that this was information that was suppressed by LANL. It was, I mean, at the time when they were approached about it, they continued to deny that there was a problem. Babies were dying in New Mexico, and the government had a full opportunity to do something, to intercede at that point, and they refused to. So in my mind, the suppression of information didn't take place. It wasn't that you guys didn't do your job. It was that LANL was suppressing information. The Department of Energy, I could go on and on.
It certainly looks like from the report, it certainly looked like that there was defensive statements, to say the most kindest way. And I think in terms of suppression, the legal department, we may not have gained access inadvertently. I mean, everybody said, oh, we don't want them to really see the bad stuff, keep these files hidden. Nobody would do that. You know, and I think it was just a process by which they said, we've got to defend privilege and confidential. I don't want any mistakes on privilege and confidential, make sure nothing gets out that way. And so they were overly protective of files, perhaps. And I don't know, in that environment, I would have thought an alternate process could have been developed, but hey, I wasn't king at the time.
Wouldn't the most provocative data available be the death of children as a result of this?
Well,
Their dose would have been, you have to admit with me that their dose would have been very high because their body mass was very small, correct?
no, they were in utero.
No, these were babies that were born that year.
It's all kinds of strange things. So clearly in the third trimester, a lot of the development of individuals has occurred. At that point, if they were irradiated, they're inside the mother, their dose, they wouldn't have had skin dose externally.
Right.
Certainly would have had iron dose and internal exposures, and they would have had a slightly reduced exposure from what the mother would receive for her whole body, but it wouldn't have been much reduced. Yeah, it's modest. It's not that they received a lot more. They received a little bit less, but the same. And in terms of the ingestion, yes, the children are much more radiosensitive, order of magnitude more radiosensitive. I'd say if you put a gun to my head and say, what are you really worried about? Are they small? Did they get more dose? No, their organs are still developing and they're 10 times more radiosensitive. You know, that's no matter what. And when I read the Alvarez paper, and I didn't read it as carefully, I need to go back and look at it now that you mention it, I assumed that Alvarez was talking about third trimester pregnancies at the time of Trinity, who then went on to give birth to a child who died prematurely. He called it, or I wanted to call it neonatal fatality, infant mortality, I think is the term he used. Yeah, I call it neonatal.
But the spikes were in the month of August, September, October, the main spikes. So they would have had to have already been born, I guess, and that's the point I'm trying to make. And I think that if, do you see what I'm saying? I guess that's what I'm trying to say.